Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Allison Pepper and I'm going to be talking today about psychological injury. Before I begin, I just want to let you guys know that some of the content we'll be covering is pretty sensitive. I'm going to be talking about some of the mental illnesses that we see in our combat veterans as well as individuals who are active military. Mental illnesses such as acute stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, or major depression. And a pretty serious symptom of these mental illnesses is suicide. And so I really encourage you guys to do what you need to do to take care of yourself as I cover this content. If you need to kind of step out of the room and come back, or maybe check in with Professor Bars, I encourage that. I also will be providing a list of resources at the end of the lecture so that if you want to take those with you and contact them later on, you can do that. And I'll also provide my contact information. So if there's something that you would like to specifically follow up on, I encourage you to do that as well. So today I'm going to be talking about psychological injury. And we'll start with some definitions of key mental illnesses related to psychological injury. That is acute stress disorder as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. You can see from the slides here, acute stress disorder, it's a disorder that begins after someone has experienced some type of trauma, like combat. Acute stress disorder is defined as when individuals' symptoms begin immediately after a trauma. And more specifically, their symptoms last from 3 to 30 days after the trauma. Now, which specific symptoms I'm referring to, we'll talk about those in a minute. But really, I want to differentiate acute stress disorder from post-traumatic stress disorder. Acute stress disorder can essentially evolve into post-traumatic stress disorder, or what's commonly known as PTSD. The idea is that if a person's symptoms of acute stress disorder last longer than 1 month, then acute stress disorder becomes post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, some people, their symptoms might go away, they might be lessened, they might be minimized, and so they may not develop PTSD, but in most cases, people with acute stress disorder do eventually develop post-traumatic stress disorder because of the long experience, the longevity of the symptoms that they have. And again, we'll talk about those symptoms and what they are here in a minute. The other thing that I want to talk about is that it is absolutely possible for some people to not develop symptoms related to their trauma well after the trauma has occurred. So in this case, if a person's symptoms begin 6 months or more after the trauma, then that would be referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder with delayed expression. What that means is that they experienced a trauma, but for some reason they, maybe, for example, in the event of a combat veteran, maybe they, the demands of their job and their responsibilities really didn't allow themselves to process what they had experienced. So when they return from combat and when they start to reintegrate into civilian life, all these symptoms may start to emerge. And so it's absolutely possible for this to happen where a person experiences a trauma and then 6 months or even longer, they start to develop the symptoms we're about to talk about. I provided this slide here just to help illustrate the differences between those three diagnoses that I just talked about. So in terms of acute stress disorder, all right, you see that here in red, the individual experiences symptoms 0 to 1 month. So here we're talking about acute stress disorder, 0 to 1 month after the experience of the trauma. And if those symptoms once again persist beyond 1 month, then the individual would be experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder as indicated by this blue shade right here. And then to help illustrate the concept of PTSD with delayed expression, this purple shade here, once again, this is when an individual's symptoms emerge about 6 months after the trauma, 6 months or more, and they certainly can persist for months and years as well. So what are the symptoms that I'm referring to? So acute stress disorder, ASD, and PTSD are, the symptoms are pretty much the same. Really, the only difference has to do with the longevity of the symptoms. So the first symptom that an individual with acute stress disorder or PTSD experiences, it's that their trauma involves some type of actual or threatened serious injury or death, either to themselves or to someone else. So this is a pretty verbose definition, and so I want to break it down a little bit here. What's meant by actual or threatened is that the individual, they might be directly affected by the trauma, but also a threatened trauma can be sufficient for post-traumatic stress disorder. So what's meant by threatened is even the risk of injury or the risk of death is sufficient to meet this criterion. In other words, the person doesn't have to actually or directly be physically hurt, but the risk is definitely sufficient to meet this criterion. Another important part that I'd like to emphasize with this criterion is that it can involve, the trauma can involve others. So as I say here, as I've written here on the slide, when it comes to others, the trauma can involve witnessing or being witnessed. The person can actually witness a trauma and not necessarily be the direct recipient of a trauma. So seeing someone else being injured, seeing someone else die is what's meant by the trauma involving self or others. And this extends to even learning about a trauma. So people who hear about someone who has been injured or hear about someone who has died in some type of trauma-related event, that too is sufficient to meet this criterion. So criterion 2 of acute stress disorder and PTSD is that the individual experiences or re-experiences the trauma. And this can look several different ways. So flashbacks, which is probably a term that you are familiar with. Flashbacks involve when a person is having recurring thoughts about the trauma. So it's as if those thoughts that they had during the trauma are present and they're real and they are on replay, as if they're being recorded in the person's mind and stuck on replay over and over and over again. Re-experiencing the trauma can also take the form of reoccurring images. So as if they have, a movie of the trauma replaying over and over in their mind. It can seem very, very real, as if the event were currently happening and they're viewing that event, that trauma, through their mind's own eye. And flashbacks can actually include perceptions. So sensing the same stimuli that were present at the trauma. So smelling the sulfur, or feeling the heat of the sun, or tasting whatever taste was present at the time of the trauma. Those perceptions can also be part of the flashback, making flashbacks extremely triggersome and devastating for the individual. Re-experiencing the trauma can also take the form of dreams, right? So a person is having often what we refer to as nightmares, recurring nightmares about the trauma. A third criterion is that the stress disorder, the acute stress disorder, the post-traumatic stress disorder involves avoidance. So what this looks like is the person avoids any type of stimuli, any type of event, any type of person that can trigger memories of the trauma. So in the using the framework of combat veterans or even active duty personnel, they might avoid Memorial Day celebrations, or they might avoid 4th of July celebrations. So any sort of event or person or stimuli, monument, statue, dedication, anything like that, that brings back those memories. So that's what's referred to as avoidance. Fourth, a person with acute stress disorder or PTSD may experience what we term reduced responsiveness. So reduced responsiveness is, it can look several different ways. So first of all, it can appear as a loss of motivation. So this loss of motivation involves activities that they once enjoyed. If they played basketball, or they enjoy playing video games, or they enjoy going golfing, they start to lose the motivation to do those things that they once enjoyed. And if they do perform those activities or involved in those activities, they tend to not experience the same amount of pleasure or the same amount of joy or happiness that those activities once provided them. Another example of reduced responsiveness is detachment. And so what detachment is, it can sound a lot like the avoidance I talked about on the previous slide, but detachment is more comprehensive. So not only is a person avoiding events or people or situations that remind them of the trauma, but detachment is about avoiding everybody, avoiding everything. Even if a person wasn't associated with a trauma, a person with acute stress disorder and PTSD might isolate from friends, isolate from family members, isolate from coworkers. So what detachment is, as it says on the slide here, it's extreme isolation. And the reason why, one of the reasons why individuals with ASD or PTSD do this is that there's this sense that no one will get them. No one will understand what they've been through, that this trauma has had such a huge impact on their being, that psychological injury, that moral injury, that the individual doesn't believe that anyone will get them. And sometimes that can include not wanting a loved one to understand what they've been through. So what I mean by that is that sometimes individuals with ASD and PTSD detach because they don't want to share their experience with a loved one, with their spouse, their partner, their friend, their coworker, because they don't want that person to know. They don't want them to understand. They don't want them to feel that amount of emotional, moral pain that they're experiencing. So in order essentially to protect that individual with whom they're close with, they detach. And then a fifth criterion of acute stress disorder and PTSD is that a person can experience increased arousal, increased anxiety, or increased guilt. So these are three different symptoms kind of combined within this fifth criterion. So increased arousal. So we have here on the slide this exaggerated startle response is really about the physiological effects of trauma. Somebody who experiences a trauma, it can heighten their nervous system so that events that are similar to the trauma can trigger them. They can induce that quick arousal. So, for example, an exaggerated startle response means when an individual might hear a car backfire and they jump really quick. Or, in the case of a combat veteran who might hear a cannon go off at a Grizz game, they might start shaking and panicking and jump, and increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, right? So it's that heightened physiological response to an event that is similar and reminds them their physiology of that trauma. So not just mentally reminding them, but physiologically they're reminded of that trauma, and thus they have that quick response. Hypervigilance is really related to that increased anxiety associated with these stress disorders. So hypervigilance is when an individual it's very nervous and they're very anxious. Another word to describe hypervigilance is the individual might be suspicious, consistently suspicious. So if they see something that reminds them or is very similar to the initial trauma, they might have a lot of racing thoughts about what's going on or what's going to happen. So for example, if an individual, a veteran, they might be consistently looking for signs of potential danger, and not just consciously looking, but just always on alert and always aware of their surroundings. They might be an individual who has to sit next to the door and have an escape route planned out in their mind, not just for themselves, but how they're going to help guide others out of their room, given their training. They're super aware of others as well as their own safety. Another example, if somebody had and it was present during like the Boston bombing, the marathon, right? That was associated with a pressure cooker hidden in a backpack. There was that backpack that was isolated and sitting next to a mailbox. So if a person was involved in that trauma, witnessed in that trauma, again, witnessing that trauma, then they afterwards, part of their stress disorder might be if they see an unattended suitcase, an unattended backpack, it might make them suspicious. What's in that backpack? Whose backpack is that? Do I need to call attention to that backpack? Again, it's that increased suspiciousness surrounding the meaning of that stimuli that's very similar to the trauma that they experienced. And then the last part of this fifth criterion, this increased arousal, anxiety, or guilt, does involve survivor's guilt, right? And this is very similar to what I imagine Professor Bars has talked about with respect to that moral injury. Many people with acute stress disorder and PTSD experience a significant amount of survivor's guilt. That question, why me? Why did I survive? And what is it about me? In fact, something that's commonly seen in veterans, according to the National Center for PTSD, many veterans do experience extreme guilt about the experiences that they've had in combat. And because of that extreme guilt, we do see elevated rates of suicidality, suicidal thoughts, and even suicidal behaviors amongst our veterans. It's something that we'll cover here in a few minutes. So let's take a look at the prevalence of acute stress disorder and PTSD. So stress disorders affects about 3.5 to 6% of our U.S. population each year. And when we look at the prevalence rates in a person's lifetime, prevalence rates range from about 7 to 12%. The ratio of men to women with stress disorders is 2 to 1. So for every 2 women, 1 man is affected with acute stress disorder and PTSD. And some people believe that elevated rate of stress disorders in women has to do with the fact that certain events are more likely to cause stress disorders, and one of those events is victimization, so physical assault and sexual assault. And because women are much more likely to be survivors of those particular traumas, it may be an accurate reflection of the increased rate of stress disorders amongst women compared to men. But there are many experts in our field that recognize that men are less likely to report men are much less likely to report the symptoms associated with stress disorders. So it may be, in fact, that there's more equal, there's the rates of stress disorders are equal between men and women, but that because men underreport, it looks like they're more common in women. So which is real? Which is the more accurate? Are women actually more affected than men? And the underreporting, we really don't know. But what research shows is that comparison for now. And then again, as I just alluded to, there are certain events that are more likely to cause stress disorders. So disasters, including natural disasters, car accidents, any type of major event like that, traffic accidents, airplane crashes, things like that. Victimization, like I referred to earlier, so physical assault, sexual assault, combat, which is something that's specific to this class and that we're focusing on here. And it's long been recognized. This isn't a new concept that soldiers experience distress during combat as well as after combat. It used to be referred to as shell shock or combat fatigue. But what is recent is the recognition of how impairing and how dysfunctional the symptoms of acute stress disorder and PTSD can be. And so it's a relatively new mental illness. It wasn't until the late 19th century and the early 21st century, that PTSD and acute stress disorder were really recognized as mental illnesses. And then, of course, terrorism and torture, two other events that are more likely to cause stress disorder. So one of the things I wanted to share with you is this video of Jereb, and he talks about his post-traumatic stress disorder and some of the symptoms he's experienced, and then you hear from individuals who are close to him, like his wife and his father-in-law, and I like to show this video because it talks about those symptoms. It makes it a little bit more real. If you haven't experienced these or haven't been close to someone with these stress disorders, then this kind of brings what the disorders look like to light, but it also highlights the impact that stress disorders can have on family. And then thirdly, it also highlights some of the stigma. Stress disorders tend to have, mental illnesses in general, tend to have a lot of stigma associated with them, and you see that reflected in this video. So let's take about 9 minutes or so to watch the video on stress disorders.
Jereb Walsh was one of 11 wounded. While he was being treated at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, doctors made another diagnosis.
I'd only heard about PTSD with Vietnam vets, and I thought that I was too young to get it. I didn't think that I would be old enough to have it.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes, yeah.
And did they tell you that's what you were showing the symptoms of?
Yeah, they said I had an extreme case of PTSD.
What are some of the symptoms?
Just irritability and impatience.
Irritability sounds like a polite way of saying you lose your temper a lot.
Yeah, I do. I don't know why, but I do. I just can't put up with anything anymore.
According to Dr. Robert Ursano, the military's leading expert on PTSD, it's more widespread than you might think.
The PTSD, in many ways, may be the common cold of psychiatry, but perhaps everyone over a lifetime has been exposed to a life-threatening event of some kind, a motor vehicle accident, a hurricane, a tornado.
But do you find people who just don't want to admit that they have PTSD?
Individuals with mental disorders frequently are frightened about talking about the problems that they have, frequently feel like they need to hide them.
Does every soldier who's been in combat get some degree of PTSD?
Everyone exposed to a life-threatening event will change in some way, and for some we may see chronic unremitting disorders.
Within days of the ambush, Walsh wrote a detailed account of what happened. But when you ask him about it now, there are things he either can't remember or doesn't like to talk about. Your memory of this seems a little hazy. Why is that?
Spent the last 10 months in therapy trying to forget about the attack. So,
I know this is tough stuff for you, but it's important to get it straight so we don't have conflicting accounts out there. So
yeah.
try to stick with it. If Walsh's memories of that day are accurate, you can understand why he doesn't want to talk about it.
There's two little kids on the bridge. One was probably about 7, the other was 10, and they both had weapons. One of them was holding his weapon upside down, which I had never. I mean, he wasn't firing. He was holding it by the clip, the banana clip, upside down, and the other kept firing off rounds at the truck. I fired over their heads, and they turned around and took off running. Later on, I seen them again, and I fired and I hit one of them. I hit the younger one.
Where'd you hit him?
I was aiming for his chest. I believe I got him in the throat. So, wasn't trying to.
This was a boy you put at about, what, 7 years old?
Yeah. 7-year-old wasn't even firing his weapon. The one actually got wasn't even firing.
A year after the ambush, Walsh was still in therapy at Walter Reed, and he had a new girlfriend, Gail Coster. Is it hard having a relationship with somebody who has PTSD?
Sometimes.
What's hard?
Just being able to figure out when it's a good day versus a bad day.
There was one very bad day last October.
He was just drunker than I'd ever seen him. I'd just never seen him that drunk. I have no idea what I said, but something I said just triggered something, and he knocked my feet out from under me, and he had me in a chokehold, and he was just on the ground just telling me, "You're going to get me in trouble, you're going to get me in trouble."
Walsh is either unwilling or unable to explain why he snapped.
I don't know. I really don't know what happened. I know we got an argument, big argument down there. And I really don't know. I couldn't tell you. I can only tell you what I'd heard.
If they hadn't pulled you off, or you would have choked her to death.
I probably, most likely would have.
Psychiatrists say heavy drinking is not technically a symptom of PTSD, and neither is violence. But with PTSD, whatever problems you had before the traumatic event will be there after. Whatever diagnosis you put on Jared Walsh's violent outburst, it was a particularly bitter twist to one man's efforts to ease the recovery of wounded soldiers coming home from Iraq.
Yeah, you warned me.
Hal Coster hosts wounded veterans and their families at his steakhouse in downtown Washington every Friday night. It was at one of these dinners that Jereb attacked Gail. Hal Coster is her father.
I don't like people beating up my daughter.
Now, do you think that's PTSD?
I know a lot of guys with PTSD and they don't beat up people. They don't beat up wives and spouses and girlfriends and stuff like that. Jereb's the only person I know that's ever done that. And that's why I don't think that's totally PTSD.
Coster knows about the stress of combat. He served 2 tours as a crew chief on a helicopter gunship in Vietnam and came home with his own case of PTSD. Do you see yourself or some of your buddies from your war in these kids?
Things haven't really changed. You go to combat, you have these feelings and these emotions, and when you step back and you get a few years older, you think, well, no matter what the Army taught us, that was still a human being that we killed. And you got to think about that long and hard.
The problem is most soldiers are dealing with it on their own. Although the Army sends combat stress teams onto the battlefield to counsel soldiers, a recent study in the New England Journal of Medicine found that 1 in 6 infantrymen returning from combat in Iraq shows signs of depression, anxiety, or PTSD. And afraid to admit they are mentally ill, up to 3/4 of them are not asking for the help they need.
If you go to get psychological help, you get a check in your little book that says you had some problems. So a lot of times what happens is the guys try to deal with it themselves, and that's not a good thing.
But they're afraid of being labeled a head case.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Don't have any use for head cases. You know, it's the guys that have had physical injuries don't have any real respect for the guys that are just head cases.
The guys that have physical injuries think the guys that are head cases just, are sissies, can't deal with it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's the same thing that's been there for years and years and years, you know. There's always been that stigma.
Jared Walsh does have a physical injury, but to him, being shot in the foot doesn't seem heroic.
Getting hurt in that attack, I mean, just my foot is the only thing that stopped me from going back. That's just, I mean, it's a shame. It's something I was ashamed of. It feels like I ran away. I mean, it feels like I got hurt and then that was my chance to get away, and that's what I did. I mean, it's not what happened, but that's what it feels like.
When you look at Jared with all his problems and consider that he almost killed Gail, you might have the same question we did.
How do you go back with a guy after something like that?
I explained, I kind of said, I don't want you drinking anymore. I do want you to get the help that you need to deal with your issues.
So you think maybe that was a turning point for him in facing his PTSD?
To some extent. He's said to me that he didn't want to lose me, so he was going to do what it would take to keep me, to make me happy. And
Just a week after she told us that, there was another fight.
he came in, he was just completely upset, just angry beyond angry, and just vented.
How?
I yelled, screamed, threw things, broke things.
He'd do anything to you?
Most things were thrown at me.
How badly did he hurt you?
I have bumps and bruises in my head. I can feel them every time I brush my hair. That's around my eye. My lip was busted up, my nose. Bruises, just sore bruises all over.
This is one very personal story which you're sharing with us. Why are you sharing it with us? Most people would tell us to butt out.
Part of me wants to tell you guys to butt out. Don't make him look bad. He's not bad. But I guess I'm still trying to get him help.
You think there are a lot of people out there going through some of the same things that you're going through with him?
Maybe not to an extreme of getting beaten up, but yeah.
Okay, so I know it's a difficult video and it raises a lot of important issues, and I hope you guys are doing what you need to do to take care of yourself. If you need to take a few minutes to process that with Professor Bars there and ask questions, I encourage you to pause this and do that. Maybe have some conversation amongst yourselves. I will be providing resources for you guys at the end of the lecture, so you guys will have some phone numbers. But if you guys want to check in with me at any time, you can always send me an email, which I'll give you guys as part of these notes as well. One thing that I do want to mention about the video is that they do talk about the violence and the substance use. And when we went over the criteria for acute stress disorder and PTSD, violence and substance use are not required. They are not part of the diagnosis. However, there are many people with these stress disorders who can be aggressive and they can be violent and they can misuse and potentially abuse substances. And as they said in the video, I liked how they said that if there are those type of unhealthy coping strategies before the PTSD, before the trauma, then the trauma and the PTSD are very likely to exacerbate them, to make them worse. So if Jared was misusing substances beforehand, if he tended to have, a violent streak, some anger issues before the trauma, it's very well likely that trauma and the PTSD, the symptoms associated with this PTSD, have exacerbated, have worsened those behaviors. So that's something that's important to understand. And then I think, also just to recognize that there is that well-established stigma, not just within the military, but in general, around mental illnesses and PTSD. And I hope that, through this class, yes, people can have physical injuries from combat, but that we're realizing that these moral injuries and these psychological injuries, that PTSD, the acute stress disorder, they can be extremely damaging. They can be extremely painful and cause a significant amount of impairment in individuals, just like physical problems. And so the need for treatment is definitely there. But the first step is recognizing these disorders and then being educated about what resources there are. So we'll get to that. The next disorder that I wanted to talk about is major depression. It's something that we also tend to see quite often in our combat veterans as well as active duty military. So major depression, I'm going to highlight the key symptoms of major depression, and they fall within these three categories of emotional, physical, and cognitive symptomatology. So examples of emotional symptoms are probably what you hear or associate most with depression. So people with major depression report having a depressed mood, right? So having that pervasive sense of sadness. Many times people with depression describe themselves as feeling empty, kind of not having any sort of happiness or any sort of joy, or the inability to experience any type of pleasure. They just feel that emptiness. Worthlessness is another common adjective used by people with depression, where they just feel like they themselves, their life is worthless, is pointless. And of course, when we hear that, it kind of raises our risk level for potential suicidality, but we'll get there in a second. Anhedonia is what I call a psychobabble term. It's a jargon term we used in psychology, and anhedonia is when a person has lost any sort of sense of enjoyment or any sort of pleasure in activities that they once enjoyed. And if this sounds similar to what we talked about with PTSD, it is. It's very similar to that loss of interest, that loss of an ability to feel pleasure when they're doing their former favorite activities. These individuals with depression, they don't enjoy things anymore, things that they once loved, their hobbies. There's not much pleasure in them at all. And if they do go play basketball or go swimming or fishing or hunting or anything like that, they tend not to find the same sort of gratification and pleasure that they once experienced. And that is anhedonia, that loss of pleasure. Physical symptoms related to depression. So many people associate like weight gain and a whole bunch of sleep with depression, and those are definitely symptoms associated with depression. But what's important to recognize is that weight and sleep can change in either direction for people with depression. So some people do gain weight, but some people might lose weight. And some people might sleep too much, and other people might not sleep at all. They kind of develop insomnia. So any sort of significant changes in weight and sleep are indicators that something psychological is happening, some type of psychological injury is present. Psychomotor symptoms, what these refer to are movement, changes in movement. And so oftentimes people with depression, they might speak very slowly, the movement, right, of speech. They might have a very monotone voice, so there's no real up or down. They're just kind of flat in how they speak. Their movement with respect to walking, they might kind of just slowly walk, maybe shuffle their feet, kind of slouch. It's a real slowness that you see in their general movement as I sit up in my chair. And then also physical symptom is fatigue. So individuals with depression often report just feeling drained, having a lack of energy. And part of that's the physiological reaction happening with the depression, where there's just this demand on their body that is just depleting their resources, and they have a really hard time finding the energy to do things that they once enjoyed. No matter how much sleep they get, this consistent sense of fatigue is present. Under cognitive symptoms, what we're talking about here is thought processes. So lack of concentration, an inability to concentrate, inability to focus in school or at work, but even at home or on the job. The ability to start and complete tasks is often compromised. And the reason is because, if they're having these intrusive feelings of sadness, of emptiness, of worthlessness, they're having a hard time finding pleasure in things that they used to enjoy, it can be really hard to sustain a level of concentration that's needed to get stuff done. Poor memory, again, because of the repetitive and consistent emotional components of depression, that sadness, the worthlessness, etc. It can interfere with their ability to remember things, to create new memories. So being able to concentrate in school and then be able to remember what they're learning, that other component can also be compromised when experiencing depression. People with depression can have a hard time making decisions. So even the simplest of decisions, like what to have for dinner tonight. Often you hear people with major depression say, I don't care, whatever. You decide. I don't know. And it's not because they're trying to be combative, and it's not because they want the other person to choose, or they genuinely just don't know. And so they'll put it off on someone else to make that decision. So what to have to dinner, or what to do for the weekend, or what classes they're going to take, or any sort of those daily life decisions we make can be a challenge. It can be very and actually exhausting for an individual with depression to put that amount of mental energy into those simple daily decisions. It can be super challenging, and that can feed into the fatigue that we just talked about with respect to the physical symptom of depression. And then another important cognitive symptom of depression includes what we call suicidal ideation, or having suicidal thoughts. One of the things that I really want to highlight is that suicide ideation really exists on a spectrum. So a lot of times people think that people who are suicidal have a plan and they are ready to carry out. And yes, that is an example of suicidal ideation, but it's on that severe end of the continuum. Suicidal ideation, less severe, but still extremely important and extremely worthy of attention and intervention, is the less severe forms of suicidal ideation, where people might have more general thoughts about suicide. So they might have a thought like, you'd be better off without me, or no one would even notice if I were gone. All right, so those kind of vague, indirect statements and thoughts about suicide exist on that continuum of suicidal ideation. So suicidal ideation can involve someone who has a plan and has, specific detailed ways of how they're going to carry out taking their own life, all the way to not having a plan, but those more general, vague thoughts. And again, no matter where a person is on that spectrum, it's considered suicidal ideation and extremely concerning. So with respect to the prevalence rates of major depression, the lifetime prevalence rate is about 18%. So 18% of us at some point in our life would qualify for a diagnosis of major depression. The lifetime prevalence rates for women and men are different, with women having elevated rates of major depression compared to men. But again, similar with the stress disorders that might be confounded by men's unwillingness or inability to report that they're having those symptoms. Typically men are there's a lot more stigma, this whole idea that men are tough and should be able to pick themselves up by the bootstraps, especially when we're talking about military personnel, really stifles their ability to come forward and report the depression. So it very well may be that in reality prevalence rates are equal, but are more equal, but with respect to what the research shows right now, we do have that disparity between men and women. Annual prevalence rates, meaning the prevalence rate of depression, major depression in a year, is about 9%. And then with respect to our combat veterans, soldiers, active duty personnel, you see there statistics that I brought in is the rate of major depression is actually 5 times higher in soldiers than civilians. So definitely an indicator of some serious psychological injury that's occurring amongst our military personnel. Now, suicide is an important topic to cover, and it is actually not an official diagnosis. Suicide is more of a symptom related to official diagnoses. So what I mean by that is someone who is suicidal, you can't assume that they have a diagnosis of major depression, and you can't assume that they have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder, because people with those two disorders, both of them can be suicidal. Okay, so suicide is associated with actually many different types of mental illnesses. To name a few, schizophrenia, anorexia nervosa, those are the two that come to mind as well. But suicide, unfortunately, our combat veterans and our active duty military personnel are at increased risk for suicide, as we see by the statistics on this slide. So the most recent estimates from the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs has found that 20 veterans a day actually complete suicide. And if we break that down, that's one veteran every 72 minutes. More active duty U.S. soldiers die from suicide than combat, which is obviously is devastating. The rate of suicide is greatest within 3 years after leaving the service. And there's a lot of explanations why that might be, but part of that is no longer does that veteran feel a connection to people who have had similar circumstances. And we'll talk here in a minute about how social support and community support can actually be a buffer for suicidality and these other mental illnesses. But that disconnect that a person feels after leaving the service can leave them kind of on the fringes of these worlds of the military, the military world and civilian life. And so not feeling like they're part of either can be extremely devastating for a veteran. So when we have veterans come in with thoughts of suicide or some other symptoms related to PTSD and depression, it's one of the red flags that we'll look for is how long out of service are they, and whether or not they have established some community support, what their family support is like, and whatnot. And then that last bullet point there, 65% of all veterans who died from suicide in 2014 were 50 years of age or older. So oftentimes there's this myth that the older generation is somehow better, maybe they have better coping skills, or that they don't struggle with depression and suicide and PTSD as our younger generations, but it's just not the case. Our elderly population are also at a heightened risk for suicide. So here are some other statistics related to suicide that I've brought in just to show how suicide rates differ amongst the different branches in the military. So Marines, Navy, Air Force, and Army, and perhaps Professor Bars can maybe pause and help highlight some of these numbers for you. The suicide gap, right? So amongst people who have never served in the military, women often complete suicide less often than men. So this is a trend we actually see in the civilian world as well, where women, they attempt suicide at much higher rates than men do, but men tend to be, they tend to complete suicide at higher rates than women. And that's largely because when men attempt suicide, they tend to use more lethal means, like a firearm or like a hanging, versus women who tend to try to overdose with pills or other less lethal means. So what are some of the warning signs of suicidality and suicide? I have these listed up here, and we will just kind of walk through these here. So obviously talking about taking one's life is a warning sign, as I alluded to earlier, that people don't have to have a very specific plan, but that general, that indirect statement is also a warning sign, where a person might say, "You'd be better off without me," or no one would even notice if I'm not here, right? Those are indirect comments, but one that are reflective of suicidality. When someone acquires, and if they have some type of lethal means, especially if it's new for them, right? So buying a gun, stockpiling pills, right? That new type of behavior is a definite red flag. A warning sign, one of the characteristic warning signs of someone who has made a plan and is actually convinced that they're going to follow through, is when they start giving away prized possessions. And that's a warning sign that someone is pretty far on the severity of suicidality. Use of alcohol or other substances. The majority of suicides are completed by people who are under the influence of alcohol or some other substance. So when someone is endorsing suicidality and they're misusing substances, it's really a dangerous, especially dangerous combination, and obviously intervention, and it is warranted immediately. That sense of hopelessness. Not everybody with depression or PTSD has that hopelessness, but once that hopelessness arrives, right, the sense that nothing is ever going to get better, those extreme thoughts, nothing is ever going to get better. I have no purpose, as stated here on the slide. My life has no meaning, right? That extreme, yes, no, always, never. When those are associated with this sense of hopelessness, it's definitely a cause for concern. When someone endorses deep sadness, right, and when that sadness, they're unable to really identify any sort of precipitating event. It might be tied to the trauma, but the sadness that the person feels is just so paralyzing that they're unable to really verbalize why they're sad. Okay, so it's not just being sad, but it's also that the effect the sadness has, and the inability to really tie it to anything, even though a professional might, or someone who is educated might be able to find the links. When a person is experiencing and expressing that sadness, that they're so sad that they're unable to really see anything else like the trigger or see any hope, that's definitely cause for concern. When a person reports feeling lonely and isolated, and for some people they very may well be, right? If they've been they're maybe estranged from family, and they don't have a partner, and many of their friends have moved on into other lives, they very well may be lonely and isolated, and that's clearly cause for concern. But also it's possible that a person has a great social support system, but yet they still sense this loneliness and this isolation, right? So it's a report that's definitely relative to the individual. Even if you feel like they do have support, it doesn't matter what you feel like. If the person themselves is reporting that sense of loneliness and isolation, then that is more, a cause for concern. Withdrawing a symptom that we saw with post-traumatic stress disorder, and can also be associated with that major depression, right? So that isolation, that detachment. When individuals are highly aroused and have a dangerous state of mind. So what's meant by highly aroused is almost that kind of that impulsivity that can accompany post-traumatic stress disorder and even major depression, right? So oftentimes people with major depression, for example, have a hard time making decisions, but when they make a decision, they have to follow through right now, right? So that impulsivity, you can see how that could lead to impulsive decisions about their suicidality, which is obviously cause for concern. So when you see that trend, someone who was reporting sadness and that fatigue is all of a sudden highly aroused and alert and excited, it can be a red flag that something is going on with respect to their suicidality. They've made a decision, for example, and an intervention should happen sooner than later. And then another warning sign is the presence of many stressors, right? When you have someone who's dealing with PTSD and major depression, if there's a lot of sudden stressors in their life, if there's sudden rejection, maybe in a relationship or related to schooling, or maybe a failing of an important test, moving locations can be stressful. Loss of a spouse, whether it's divorce or it is a death, right? That is a huge stressor. Anticipated loss of financial security, right? So the threat of financial insecurity is also a major stressor. Any of these can be a trigger, right? Can just add on to the pile of despair. And so when we know when someone is dealing with PTSD and major depression, and we recognize these quick onset of additional stressors, it's a time to reach out and to offer support to that person. So let's talk about that. What are some protective factors of suicide, right? Because not everybody with depression and not everybody with PTSD are actively suicidal. There are things that can help reduce their suicidal ideation and help protect them from those devastating thoughts and actions. So, like I mentioned earlier, a solid social support system. When you have support from family and friends, when you feel like there are people that you can turn to and talk to, that is a major protective factor. It can be super beneficial for people who are dealing with mental illnesses like depression, PTSD, or the symptom of suicidality. People who have good problem solving and conflict resolution skills, that's kind of psychobabble, but essentially what that means is people who have healthy ways of coping, right? So when they get frustrated, what do? Do they turn to substances, or do they go run, or do they go work out, or do they go call a friend, or do they bury themselves in some hobby that is more that is healthier? Right, so those are what are meant by good problem solving and conflict resolution skills. Cultural and religious beliefs, right? So people who have a strong affiliation and connection with their cultural group or maybe their religious organization tend to fare better in terms of their risk of suicidality than individuals who don't have that connection. Part of that is because of the support that one can find amongst people of their similar cultural backgrounds, or the support that an individual can find among their religious group. But also that belief, the belief in a higher power, the belief in God, or the belief in whatever higher power that person has control, that entity has control, that entity is protecting me, that I can turn and I can pray, or I can go to confession, or I can, smudge, whatever coping skill that is associated with that religion or cultural belief can also have protective factors. Future-oriented thinking and planning, right? So people who do believe that it's the opposite of hopelessness, right? It's that belief that things will get better, that I can get through this, that I have people I can rely on, right? It's that thinking about the future and being able to look forward to it can be a protective factor. A history of help-seeking behavior, what that means is that people who have a history of seeking help in the past. So the statistics that I have here on the slide just illustrates how studies have been conducted that have shown that veterans who have a history of reaching out, maybe that involved calling a psychologist at VA services or checking in with a physician at VA services, right? Veterans who have that history of reaching out for help have far less suicidality than veterans who don't, right? And hopefully that's intuitive why that is, right? If you're reaching out and receiving those services where you feel like you have that social support and that connection, that can really be beneficial. Being healthy and active, physically healthy and active, is a protective factor. Part of that plays into the coping mechanism one uses when they're dealing with difficult thoughts and emotions. And then seeking treatment and having a strong therapeutic alliance, right? So what that means is veterans, and actually for even civilians who have a therapist, someone that they know that they can go to talk to be open and honest with, who can process those difficult thoughts and those feelings that might have a lot of stigma attached to them, the hopelessness and the guilt, right? That moral injury. People who believe they have someone that they can go to and really process and work through that, they do better, right? They're much less likely to have thoughts of suicide, and if they do, then they're much better at coping with them effectively. So some ideas, some suggestions for you all, if you know someone or if you're eventually working with someone who has thoughts of suicide, some tips on how to respond to somebody. So if you suspect that someone you know, your friend, your partner, your colleague is suicidal, first and foremost ask. This might seem scary. Oftentimes there's a fear that if I ask if a person is suicidal, that's going to cause them to actually go through with it. And the research shows that that's not the case at all. In fact, research shows that when people ask about suicide, it actually helps the person feel more open to share about their thoughts, and they're less likely to follow through. And it is okay to ask directly, are you suicidal? Okay, the reason is because it's much easier for a person who's suicidal to say yes in response to that question than it is for a person who's suicidal to say the complete sentence, I am suicidal. Okay, that or I am thinking of suicide. It's a much longer sentence. Takes much more energy, and for some it's embarrassing, right? There's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of fear associated with that long sentence. So by asking, are you suicidal, and the person who you're talking to says yes, it's a much easier way to respond. Okay, it takes much less energy, and it tends to be a little bit less stigmatizing and fearful. And with that disclosure, then you're able to take the next steps. Okay, so it is okay to ask. In response to someone who says that they're suicidal, or having even those vague and direct thoughts about suicide, just listen. Sometimes people panic about asking because they don't know what to say, and sometimes you don't have to say anything. Sometimes just listening and allowing the person to share their thoughts, because thoughts are just that, they're just thoughts. Thoughts don't mean a person's going to act. So sometimes just talking about it is a way to minimize and lessen the impact that those suicidal thoughts can have. So listening is a huge help for someone who's struggling with that continuum of suicidality, giving that person your full attention. Don't interrupt them. Like, what about this, and how come that, and maybe you should do this. All those interjections take the person out of where they are. It can be a distraction. So just let them talk. Let them talk and hear their own thoughts out loud. And again, that can sometimes help minimize and lessen the impact that the thoughts are having on them. Be empathetic. So even if you can't relate, even if you think they should not feel suicidal, don't share that. Be empathetic. Okay, don't rush to that judgment. What about this? And you have so much to live for, right? Because what you're doing is you're invalidating their experience. So what you want to do is just, I understand. This sounds really hard. I'm so sorry you're going through this. How can I help you? Right? Those types of phrases are much more empathetic, much less judgmental, and show that you're respecting where the person is at this moment. Try to get the person help. Okay, so especially if they're on that severe end of the suicidal continuum, you can, and this is why I'm giving this lecture and providing you resources. You want to be equipped with those resources so that you know where to go. I'm assuming none of you are trained professionals, and so it can be scary to have someone admit that they're suicidal. So having these resources of professionals who are trained and who know what to say can help minimize your fear. So examples of how you can try to help to get someone help. Will you come with me to the counselor? When you're ready, I'm here for you. I'll walk you there. And if you want me to go in with you, I can, but that's up to you, right? So maybe a counselor, or, again, that religious belief or affiliation, maybe they want to go see their priest or their minister. Maybe they have a professional that they are connected with, a nurse, a psychologist, a medical doctor. You can offer to take them there, to go with them to that appointment. And so in asking or trying to get the person help, you want to try to get that verbal commitment. So will you let me take you to that appointment? Right? And again, you're asking a complete sentence so that all they have to do is say yes. Because that is much easier for the person than them saying, will you come with me to the appointment? Right? A lot of energy, a lot of effort goes into that. And so by you offering, then that takes that away and empowers them a little bit more, gives them that energy to perhaps say yes and allow you to accompany them. You can even say things like, I want you to live, right? Will you promise me to stay alive until we can get you some help? Right? So that verbal commitment can be a pretty powerful tool in helping an individual get help. Also important, depending on the level of suicidality, if a person is, they have a plan and they're pretty convincing, you don't want to leave them alone, right? So, if you need to kind of set some of your plans aside, it's worthwhile until you can get that person to a trained professional to respond in a way that is something, probably a way you don't know. So again, if a person is imminently suicidal, let's not leave them alone. See if you can perhaps remove firearms, or if you can help distract or minimize their access to any sort of lethal means, like a stockpile of pills. If you need to dispose of them, then that's definitely recommended. Offering hope, right? So it might sound very trite, but letting the person know is, hey, I'm here for you and I want to see you live. And I can see all the things that are in your life that are going well. And I know that's hard for you, but let's get you to a place where you can see those too, right? So, again, not taking away from where they are, but also acknowledging and bringing in that hopefulness. If a person is imminently suicidal and you're feeling like this is beyond your capabilities as a friend, as a partner, as a coworker, take them to the ER. Or call 911. If they won't go to the ER, then you can also call 911 and have trained personnel come, and they can make that decision. And then having access to those resources, that last bullet point there. So, when you're ready, or you're able to tell the person, hey, can I walk you here? Can I drive you here? Where is here? Right? So there's a lot of different resources in our community that are prepared to help individuals with thoughts of suicide, and whether that's specific to veterans or active duty personnel or not, I have some listed on this slide. So the Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a free phone call that people can make, either for themselves, or if you're supporting someone who is suicidal, you can make that phone call too. So, hey, can I call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline with you? And maybe they can talk us through and give us some ideas on how to make it through this moment. Right? That's something you can do as a support person. You can also text a crisis line. So some people just don't feel comfortable having that verbal conversation, and that's okay. There's the option to text. There is a Missoula crisis response team you can also call. So trained professionals who are local, who are much more aware of community resources, that can be a support. For students, there's Curry Health Center and the counseling services there. So they do provide crisis counseling. So if someone is in imminent danger, you absolutely can call them. But if you know someone, or you yourself are having, are relating even to the symptoms of depression we've covered, the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, those general thoughts of suicide, you can absolutely receive counseling from our very own Curry Health Center. You pay that fee when you pay your tuition, and even if you haven't paid that health fee, you can always pay that health fee at any time, so that any time in a semester, so that you can go and access those services. Missoula Vet Center, so a local resource that is specific to our veterans, can provide crisis intervention as well as some counseling. Vets for Warriors is another local resource. Tamarack Grief resource, and I've misspelled grief there, so that's embarrassing, but they still are a really valid and beneficial resource. Addiction services. So again, if someone or you yourself also struggle with addiction and substance use, then those are trained professionals. And not to say that any of the above resources can't help people who are struggling with mental illness or suicide and addiction, but that's just a specialized service that you might want to reach out to. And then Western Montana Mental Health Center is also another resource in the community that provides services, not just for students, but for community members. And they take different types of insurance, and a great resource for maybe some longer term therapy if that's what's needed. If you have any questions about these, you can always just Google them. Many resources have their own web page with descriptions, but you can also always contact me. Okay, you can always contact me. Here's my email. It truly is the best way to get a hold of me. I have an office here at Missoula College, but I actually go back and forth between Missoula College and the Mountain campus, because right now I'm working at SARC, the Student Advocacy Resource Center, on some prevention education curriculum for students. So I go back between campuses is the bottom line, and if you ever have any questions about the resources or any questions about the content of this lecture, I would be more than happy to either reply via email, or we can make an appointment. I can hold an office hour and meet you in one of my offices, either here at Missoula College or at SARC. And if you're not comfortable with me, I really encourage you guys to maybe pass along questions and comments to your Professor Bars, and maybe she can ask me, because if there's any loose ends, I want to make sure that those are tied up. We've covered some really intense stuff here, and so I just want to make sure that if there's any questions, comments, concerns, that you guys know that you can always reach out to me or Professor Bars. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this lecture, watch this lecture, and hopefully I'll hear from some of you.